Hello ladies and gentlemen. As many of you probably know by now, Nanoweave has functionally been removed and there's been a lot of effects of this, but none are more important than the headshot multiplier associated with killing someone essentially being lowered. Now this was because Nanoweave only applied to body, it didn't apply to heads, and so removing Nanoweave essentially means that it takes less body shots relative to headshots to kill the opposition. And so essentially by removing Nanoweave functionally, now headshots do less damage relative to body shots, and that's really good for new players. And so I do first want to mention that in, as this is good in general. However, I do have a few big problems with the Nanoweave change, and the first one I want to talk about is that the time to kill people now is, in my opinion, a little bit too low. And that's because, in my opinion, when you're peeking a corner or you're going against an NC max, Nanoweave used to apply to all of these different types of weapons shooting at you. However, now you get killed a lot more easy, especially in those scenarios. So when you're peeking a corner, maybe someone then comes and peeks you and you don't have time to react. Or maybe you're peeking a corner, you kill someone, they don't have time to react. And so the game is less now about aim and more about who has the drop on the other person. That's also why we're seeing a lot more people run Sensor Shield, especially on Heavy Assault now, because that is the kind of meta of Planetside, especially now. Likewise with NC Maxes, they're very strong right now because you can one-shot people very easily, even if it's a Heavy Assault that you're facing, whereas before if you were playing Heavy Assault and you were against an NC Max, you could generally slither away on like 200 HP, whereas now you do die more often. I've also found that running away from the opposition, disengaging when you're in a disadvantaged engagement is more difficult relative to before, because now you can get lasered down a lot quicker, and so oftentimes it's better just to see who wins the duel rather than run away and re-engage on your target. Now if I was a game dev, I would look to increase the resistances associated with shooting at infantry to Nanoweave levels, but apply it to everyone instead of just people that equip Nanoweave, and I would also make it apply to heads, that extra resistance. And so really I'm looking at something that has a higher time to kill but keeps the headshot multiplier at where it currently is. And so the game isn't awful right now, I'm not super mad or anything, but I do think a higher time to kill slightly would be nice. Hopefully the devs will at some point do this, although I have my reservations as to if they actually would. There's a few other effects of the Nanoweave change as well. One of them is the SMG Infiltrator especially has a higher relevancy relative to before, because if you get the drop on someone you can laser them down a bit quicker than you could previously, and so Infiltrator, especially SMG Infiltrator with say a flash to go invisible, Campasundi, has a lot more relevancy than it previously did, although previously it was also in my opinion very underrated as a way to play the game if you enjoy that. One thing I definitely am happy with the changes is that now people run around a lot faster, and myself as well, and so that lower movement speed did feel a bit groggy, it didn't feel as good playing the game, and so I am happy from that aspect that as someone who does generally meta slave if I'm trying to record gameplay, even though I won't Zargtaf that much, generally speaking not having to run around slower is nice. Another change that the game did definitely add in last time was that now a lot more people are running grenade attachments with their guns and also bandolier, and so you do see more grenades being thrown previously to before, and in response a lot more people are running flak. In my opinion, people running advanced shield capacitor, which gives you a 1 second reduction on your shields, are insane, because flak is just a very viable option right now. Again, unless you're not seeing that many grenades because maybe you're in a Zarg fight and there's a lot of open ground, maybe then it isn't as important. But for most people, flak right now, or bandolier if you have some spare nanites, is really strong. One of the downsides of this change with more grenades being thrown is you definitely do have more screen shake relative to before. Arguably, people could now say something like Sensor Shield and maybe even Battle Hardened might have a bit more viability relative to what it used to, and that's what I might consider switching to instead of Avoidance. My personal hatred is towards mines. I hate them. I often go to bases solo or with a small squad, and I'm almost always fast in a building, and so dying to mines is annoying. Although, and I do find it quite funny when then the next person after me runs in and they die to a mine because they think it's clear after a run through with Avoidance. I think as well, a lot of people forget that people use LMGs because of their high ammo capacity as one of the main reasons they use it. Now, because essentially the time to kill has been lowered, that means you need less bullets to kill the enemy, and that does leave a small stealth buff to SMGs, and realistically it's a buff to any class that doesn't have an LMG equipped. And again, that's because especially in those lower ammo pool weapons, you might have 30 ammo, and that 30 ammo will now maybe last you say 10% longer, 20% longer if you're shooting at the opposition in theory. And so that most certainly is a small buff to those classes. Now, of course, as well, with the suit slot changes, one could make a small argument for Munitions Pouch as well. Being able to automatically reload a decimator does have some use in certain scenarios, and I don't think that I should underplay that because it is actually a very useful tool, especially if say someone's camping a door frame and you're trying to get in and you know they're inside the building. Decimators actually have a lot of use in that scenario. And likewise, of course, if you want to keep your downtime low and also shoot at maxes, having Munitions Pouches is useful because then you can shoot a max, switch back to your main gun, go do something else, then 10 seconds later you can shoot again with the decimator if you decide that you need it. On Combat Medic as well, I do think people are running Adrenaline Pump instead of Nanoweave more often now, and it is something that I think is still undervalued in the meta on Combat Medic, although of course if you don't want to be selfish, Bandolier still is the obvious option, especially in point hold situations. Now there were of course also the changes to some of the weapons. I do honestly feel like the weapons didn't entirely get buffed in the way that they probably should have. The Orion still is the meta, and the Beetlejuice is still the meta. On NC, the Saw is still undeniably the meta. I would also say that in general people are running the NS11P, I believe it's called, on the Medic, and also the NS15M2 a lot more than they previously were. And even things like the NSX Naginata, the Obelisk, the Solstice has seen more use relative to what it previously was at. And so I am happy with that, but I do think there's still a lot of room for improvement in terms of the viability of other guns relative to the meta equivalents of those guns. I remember in other games very clearly that there wasn't a clear meta for other games in the same way that there is in Planetside. And I do think part of that is because the other options are not as appealing, and I really would like to see further changes to the weapons, but at this point I very much doubt that they would do it. They've probably done their path, and the most we could hope for is in Planetside 3 that things are a little bit better balanced. If that ever comes out in say a few years, although probably won't in all likeliness if I'm being honest, or another patch for Planetside 2 maybe in a few years after a new dev came in or something like that. Those are the only two real scenarios I see in which we're going to see further additional changes to the weapons in any large scale way like we have this time. Now I would be interested in hearing what are your thoughts on the meta, and I do try to read all comments, and I would say I at the moment read all of them, and I do try to respond to any I can add value to. I would super appreciate it if you could subscribe because it helps the channel a bunch. Have a great day, and until next time, I'll see you guys around. Bye bye, GG.